So, what does it really take to make a champion? Is it something that's just pre-written in our DNA? Or is it all about the endless hours of practice, the right environment, and just plain old willpower? Well, today, we're going to unlock the genetic blueprint and really explore that fascinating and, let's be honest, kind of controversial world where nature and nurture collide in elite sports. All right, let's get into it.
You know, the great Muhammad Ali said it best. He who has no imagination has no wings. It's such a powerful idea, right? It reminds us that potential, no matter where it comes from, genetics or anywhere else, it needs a vision to actually take flight. But that begs the question, how much of that potential is already coded into ourselves before we even learn to walk? To really untangle this, we don't need some abstract thought experiment. No, we have one of the most incredible, real-world case studies in the entire history of sports. The story of Venus and Serena Williams.
I mean, think about it. They were raised on the public courts of Compton, and their father, Richard Williams, famously mapped out a 78-page plan for their tennis domination before they were even born. Talk about the ultimate experiment in nurture, right? But you just can't ignore their shared genetics, their height, their incredible power, that uncanny coordination. You have two sisters from the same gene pool who both reached the absolute top of the same sport. It's the perfect storm for asking our big question.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll tackle the heritability question. Then, we'll decode the genetic blueprint itself. After that, we'll look at the amazing epigenetic switch, check out the specific genes of the elite, and finally, we'll try to answer if our DNA is a code or if it's our destiny.
First up, heritability. It sounds complicated, but it's really just a measure of how much the differences in a trait, like, say, how tall you are or how high you can jump, come down to your genes. And one of the best ways scientists have to study this is by looking at twins, especially twins who were separated at birth.
And to see just how powerful genetics can be, you have to hear the absolutely astonishing case of the Jim twins. They were separated at just 4 weeks old and didn't meet again until they were 39. And what they found was a lifetime of just eerie similarities. Both had married and divorced women named Linda. Then, both remarried women named Betty. Both had sons named James Allen or Alan. They both took vacations at the same beach in Florida, were good at math but terrible at spelling, and get this, both had a childhood dog named Toy. It's an almost unbelievable story about the influence of our genes.
And that wild story isn't just a fluke. It's actually backed by some serious data. When scientists put a number on heritability for athletic traits, those numbers are just staggering. I mean, look at this chart. Things like explosive power, height, even your max oxygen consumption, which is a huge deal for endurance. They're all shown to be over 90% heritable in some studies. That tells us that our genes provide a very, very strong foundation.
Okay, so to understand how all this works, we need to zoom way in, right into the blueprint itself. Let's do a quick breakdown of the basic building blocks of our genetic code.
It all starts with a cell, right? Our bodies have trillions of them. Inside the nucleus of each one, our DNA is packed super tightly into 23 pairs of these things called chromosomes. Now, if you could unwind a chromosome, you'd find the DNA itself, that famous double helix. And a specific little section of that DNA that does a job, that's what we call a gene. And each gene is basically a set of instructions for building one specific protein.
Now here's a super important word for this conversation, allele. Just think of it as a different flavor or a different version of the same gene. These tiny little variations in the genetic code are what make us all different, from our eye color to, you guessed it, the raw materials for athletic talent.
And the combination of alleles you get from your parents is what determines how a trait actually shows up. So if you get two identical alleles for a gene, you're called homozygous. If you get two different ones, you're heterozygous. This is a really key idea we're going to come back to when we look at specific sports genes.
Okay, so we've got our blueprint, our DNA sequence. But you know, a blueprint is kind of useless without a builder to read it and decide which parts to focus on. And that's exactly where epigenetics comes into the picture. It's this dynamic layer of control that sits right on top of our DNA.
So here's the most important thing to get. Epigenetics does not change your genes, it changes gene expression. The best way to think about it is like a series of dimmer switches on your DNA. Things in your environment and your lifestyle can turn the expression of certain genes up or turn them way down, basically telling your body which parts of the blueprint to read and which parts to ignore for now.
And what's flipping these switches? Well, you are. Your life is. Intense exercise can trigger these epigenetic changes that help your muscles grow. The food you eat can literally send signals to turn down the genes that cause inflammation. It means our DNA isn't just shouting orders at us. It's in this constant conversation with how we live. Every single workout, every meal, every good night's sleep. It's all a message that can fine-tune our genetic expression.
So let's put this blueprint into action and look at some of the actual genes that have been linked pretty heavily to elite performance. Now, there are hundreds of genes that play a role, but a few really stand out in all the research.
A classic example is the ACE gene. It comes in two main flavors, or alleles. The I allele is linked to endurance, and you see it a lot more often in elite long-distance runners. But the D allele, that's all about strength and power. And surprise, surprise, you find it way more frequently in elite sprinters. It's the same gene, just different versions, giving people an edge in totally different sports. And this gets even more dramatic with a gene called ACTN3, which people have nicknamed the speed gene. This chart here shows how it's distributed. The RRR version is the power variant. In most of us, it's a pretty even mix. But just look at the sprint Olympians. The RR type is just overwhelmingly dominant. This is actually one of the strongest genetic links ever discovered in sports science. It's pretty incredible.
So, all of this new knowledge has led us straight to a very modern dilemma. With commercial genetic testing becoming so common, any of us can now take a peek at our own athletic blueprint. But the real question is, what do we do with that information?
I mean, companies now offer these services that'll analyze your DNA and spit out a report just like this. They claim they can tell you your potential for power versus endurance, your muscle fiber type, how fast you recover, even your risk of injury, all to help you create this super personalized training program.
But this is where it gets ethically complicated. Is it really right to test kids and then maybe steer them away from a sport they love just because their genes aren't perfect for it? Could we end up creating this new kind of genetic inequality where we're labeling kids as gifted or ungifted from day one and maybe robbing them of the joy of just trying and working hard?
Before we get too carried away with this idea of a genetic superathlete, let's just look at the odds. Researchers actually calculated the probability of one person having the ideal version of just 23 different endurance-related genes. And the odds? Less than 1 in 20 quadrillion. That's a 20 with 15 zeros after it. In other words, it's basically impossible.
And in fact, when scientists studied a bunch of elite athletes, they found that on average, they only had about half of the so-called ideal gene variants. This tells us something so important. Becoming a champion isn't about being dealt a perfect genetic hand. It's about playing an imperfect hand perfectly. It's about making up for your weaknesses just as much as it is about playing to your strengths.
And that brings us to the final and maybe most crucial takeaway from all of this. Our genetic code isn't this rigid set of instructions that seals our fate. It's much more like a set of possibilities. This quote just sums it up perfectly. Genes do not determine what we are. They only determine what we can become. The blueprint gives us the potential, sure, but it's the training, the passion, the environment, and yeah, the imagination that actually builds the champion.